We've mentioned this before, but it's a core concept in most MVC frameworks, so it bears repeating again. With MVC frameworks, you won't use URL or form variables, or request variables for that matter. This is a very important paradigm shift when moving from legacy procedural code into an MVC framework. URL, form, and request scopes basically go away, and they're replaced by the request collection RC scope, which is used instead. Anything you put in the RC or PRC scopes is automatically available in your app's handlers, views, layouts, and interceptors. It doesn't matter if it's a query, array, boolean value, whatever. You do rc.variablename or prc.variablename, and it's available to all of those sections of your application. Here's our user's handler and the list action method inside it. We're getting some data from our user's model and saving it into the PRC scope for later use. And here is our view, where we're looping over the items in that array and drawing them back out to the screen. You can see here when I go take a look at my web browser, that code works. Refresh the screen just so you can see it in action one more time. We're on the user's list URL. That points to the user's list handler action in our code. And there's our output from the array. And you can see right now we're using the PRC scope like we mentioned before. I can go in here to my user's handler and change that from prc.arrayUsers to rc.arrayUsers. Let me make that same change here in the view. And now when I refresh my page, you'll see that it works the exact same way as it did before. There's no difference visually in using the RC scope or PRC scope. It's just a best practice to keep the private data that comes out of things like your database queries in the PRC scope and keep the items like URL and form variables in the RC scope. Now notice the if statement at the bottom of our view. It's looking for a variable rc.message. Remember, the RC scope replaces the URL, form, and request scopes. So I can go to my URL and do something like this, $message equals hello. And now you'll see we get our message appearing on the bottom of the screen, which came out of the RC scope. This is of course a URL variable, but we're not using the URL scope in our code. We're using rc.message, like that down here. So you can see ColdBox is automatically taking what would have normally been a URL dot variable in a legacy ColdFusion application, and it's automatically putting it into the RC scope for us, like so. Now let's take that one step farther. I'm going to go here into my handler, and right below my PRC array users code, I'm going to say rc.message equals goodbye. Now we'll go back to our browser, where we still have our URL variable url.message set to hello. That's what's being outputted here as rc.message. And when I refresh this page, you can see that our output message changes from hello to goodbye. So it's now ignoring the URL variable that got copied into our RC scope. And instead, it's using the more specific item that came out of our handler that's also using the RC scope for that data. So you can store things in the RC scope both in code like we have here in our handler, or you can store them in items like the URL, and then those items get copied from the URL scope into your RC scope. But obviously if you have both a URL item and code in your handler right into that same variable, the items in the handlers are going to win and they'll override whatever came in from the URL. We'll have lots of code examples in the other videos, and you'll get much more exposure to the RC and PRC scopes as we move through those other lessons. There's also the event object that gets passed into all of our handlers. We've kind of been ignoring that up until now. Inside the event are several helper functions that can be useful when dealing with these different scopes. You've got setValue and setPrivateValue. Those are the event object's way of assigning things into the RC and PRC scopes respectively, sort of the long form version of just saying rc.variablename. So for example, on line 2 on the screen, you can see event.setValueName Luis. That would be the same as saying rc.name equals Luis. Line 3, event.setPrivateValueName equals Luis is the same as prc.name equals Luis. You're just using the event object itself and its helper functions instead of rc.variablename or prc.variablename. They do the exact same thing. You've also got helper functions to check if a value exists, set defaults, remove values from either scope, and a few other helper methods for dealing with layouts and views. We'll get into those a bit more in some of the other videos in the series.